Okay, this lesson we're going to look at how you do the chi-squared analysis, but using your TI-84 plus. So just to remind you a few of the things that you need in the exam, you are going to have to be able to state the null and alternative hypotheses for chi-squared. So if you're not sure about how to write the null and alternative hypotheses, you need to be looking back through particularly the last video, because it tends to be the independence test, the chi-squared independence test that comes up rather than the chi-squared goodness of fit. So you need to know how to do the null and alternative hypotheses for that test. Now, you need to also be able to do the calculations that we did last lesson to create a table of expected values. You can do it on your calculator. When we do the test in a minute, the calculator actually produces the table of expected values for you. But you've got to be able to explain how they are produced. So there's no getting away from that one. You also need to be able to calculate the degrees of freedom, particularly using that two-way contingency table. And then you'll have to be able to use your calculator to calculate the chi-squared statistic, the p-value, and use those two things to decide whether to accept or reject the null hypothesis. When you come to do your IA, you're going to need to do the whole of the chi-squared calculations by hand, not using your calculator. That's really, really important. So the last lesson wasn't just a waste of time. It wasn't just me getting you to calculate chi-squared for fun, even though obviously it was lots of fun. It is because you're going to need it for your internal assessment. Okay, so let's move on and actually have a look at how we do this with the TI-84 plus. So we're going to use this table of values, which we used last lesson. And I'm just going to input that data now into my calculator. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on the second button. And then I'm going to click on this button here, and you can see matrix written here. So it brings up all of these possible matrices. Now a matrix, you can imagine, is just like a table. I don't want to name them, and I don't want to do any maths with them. I want to edit them. So I go across to edit, and on A, click enter. Now it's going to ask me for the size of my matrix. This is the size of your table. It doesn't need totals. So we count 1, 2, 3, 4 columns and 2 rows. So I need to put in 2 rows first of all and 4 columns and hit enter. And then it gives me the space, 2 rows and 4 columns. There's another column here that you can't quite see, to put in my data. In between each point I hit enter. So I'm going to put in 60, enter, 54, enter, 46, enter, and 41, enter. Now because we got to the end of the matrix, it drops you down into the next row. I'm going to put in 40, 44, 53, and 57. And now I've got all of my data in matrix A, and I can scroll across to see the first column and scroll across to see the fourth column. So I'm now going to go back to stat, where we've been going for the last few lessons, but instead of going to edit or to calc, I'm now going to go to tests, and I'm going to scroll down until I see the symbol for the chi-squared test, and the symbol is this one here. Okay, the funny little x squared. And I'm going to hit enter. And then it asks me where my observed data is. Well, I just put that into matrix A. It also asks me where I would like it to put the expected data, and it's going to put that into matrix B for me. And I go down to calculate and I hit enter. And it gives me these bits of information. First of all, it gives you your chi-squared value. So I've got a chi-squared value of 8.006 with 3 degrees of freedom. You could use these two pieces of information with the chi-squared table, just like we have been for the last few lessons. Or you can use the p-value. This, basically, if I find the table, here we go. So the p-value relates to these values along the top here. So if I have a look, if I find 3 degrees of freedom here, and I find the value 8.006, or as close to 8.006 as I can get, it is between this value and this value here, which you can see relates to around about 0.45, or about 0.5. I would probably pick this value here, 0.05. So because we've landed in this column here, 0.05 or below, I would reject my null hypothesis. So these are the pieces of information. The exam might ask you for the chi-squared value, it might ask you for degrees of freedom, it could ask you how you calculate degrees of freedom, so you need to know that. It might ask you to draw a table of expected values, in which case you can go back to second, now that we've done our chi-squared test, matrix, and you can go across, back to edit, and look, B has now been filled in. So let's have a look at what B says. Here we go. It has now filled in the expected values all across here. And if we look back at our table from last lesson here, just going to move that out of the way. There we go, 50.886, 50.886, 49.868, 49.868. So those expected values are exactly as we expected them. However, you might be asked how you calculate the expected values. So be prepared to be able to explain it. So you can now use this technique to work through the homework that I set you. Remember, I wanted one question written out in full, completed by hand, and then you can do the rest using the calculator. Make sure that you answer it fully, and even if the question doesn't ask you for it, I'd like null hypothesis, alternative hypothesis, a table of expected values, the chi-squared value, the p-value, and the degrees of freedom.